all to our second Office Hours webinar in 2022. Pleased to host Mitch. As you know, Mitch has been a very close friend and also an avid contributor to our family. So it's 7 a.m. where Mitch belongs. So Mitch, thank you so much for joining early. And if you haven't listened to Scribble Talk episode with Mitch, it's available in episode 76. You know, Mitch has been managing proposals well over 25-30 years, started way back in 1996 for University of California, Riverside. He also joined the APMP, the industry body, in 1998 and became a fellow. Actually, he's one of the very few handful of people who have got a fellowship from the nonprofit sector other than the federal and the commercial. That too, like 20 years ago. So he has been an active member of the APMP California chapter, previously Southern California. Today it's called Western chapter from 2010. And he has won well over $50 million per year type of grants and funding type of proposals. So well placed to talk about how to write grants in this talk. He's now retired and is actually looking to be even more busy to do more things. He has a background in journalism in University of Missouri and worked for about 12 years in newspapers prior to that. So you all knew Mitch, but I thought I'll give a short introduction and we'll begin. But please do stay until the end. As you know, we will have a Scribble quiz in the end. We'll ask you 3 questions. And from the webinar, whoever answers it first will get one of our Jumpstart workshop. Plus, we are starting to track points now. People who come regularly to our things, obviously, we should give them something. So we're tracking attendance. Please do ask questions in the chat box, and we will also monitor the engagements within the sessions. Please do share your feedback, start to share in social media, anything, because it's important, because we are doing it to democratize meeting knowledge, as you know, through our podcasts, webinars, templates, courses. We make it available for free or no cost. So all we need is your encouragement. That's it. We will accumulate all the points and we will start to make a leaderboard from Valentine's Day, February 14. That's a little satisfaction from us that we want to share it to you. So without taking any more time, welcome to Office Hours Webinars. Mitch, good to have you back.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be back. I appreciate the invitation and I'm glad so many people have logged on wherever you are in the world. It's, as he said, pretty early in the morning here, but the sun is up and looking like a nice day. Just to get started, you saw, I hope, the summary of this, where we kind of compared grants versus contracts as driving the same car on different sides of the road. That's, I think, a pretty good metaphor for what we're doing. But really what motivated this is I've been with APMP since the mid-90s. And actually went to some meetings where, talking about what I did and people said, oh, you write grants? Kind of like, what are you doing here? That's not what APMP is about. And maybe it's not what APMP is about, but the tools really are the same. And I have to say it's a lot of what I learned and a lot of what I was able to do was because of APMP and because I was able to take what I learned there and apply it to my situation. So we're going to hope, there we go. I'm hoping everyone can see the slides and hear me okay. If you're having any trouble hearing, I've got the chat box open and Bhaskar's also keeping a good eye on the chat, so we'll fix whatever comes along. And if you have questions along the way, by all means, please ask them. Also, one moment, you saw there are a lot of slides in this presentation that are meant to be read rather than spoken. Don't try to study them or scan them or copy down URLs and things. Bhaskar will be sharing this presentation with you after this, and you've got my email address right here on the first slide. If you need a copy from me, just email me and I'll send it to you. The important thing is to get the ideas across, to absorb it in your head, not to capture the words on the screen, because that can be done later. So as I said, this is actually the car I drive. It's a model that Nissan sells all over the world. So some of them come off the assembly line looking like my car, here this one on the right, and some of them come across the assembly line looking like this. And it is the same car, except not. I mean, if you plopped me down in this car on the left this morning, I could find my way around, but everything would be just different enough to be a little foreign and a little different. So we're going to kind of build on that theme throughout this next hour. We'll talk about what's the same, what's different, and how the same tools are used in different ways when you're applying for a grant rather than when you're applying for a contract or other funding mechanism. So first off, we'll talk about the different funding mechanisms and their characteristics. I hesitate to use the word definition because the definitions are kind of squishy, as you're going to see. How those differences drive the way we do capture and formulate our value proposition, and then how we actually build the proposal. We'll talk about how the proposal, the actual components differ, scope of work, milestones, deliverables. These two terms, output and outcome, I'm going to spend some time on because they can be a little unusual in the contract space. And then finally, at the end, we'll spend a little bit of time doing a hypothetical proposal for a perpetual motion machine, one for a contract, one for a grant. And so you'll kind of see side by side how this works. So we'll start with some definitions. The easy one first, a purchase. Purchase is when you need paper clips and the person pulls out the company credit card or issues a purchase order or something, and you just go buy the thing off the shelf and away you go. That's pretty straightforward. I will say there are ways to kind of game the purchasing system. Very early in my career, I had someone, an organization that needed a proposal written. Hiring a consultant takes 6 weeks and the proposal was due in 4 weeks. So they said, hey, you know what? We're not going to hire you to write a proposal. We're going to buy a report from you. And the report looks just like this. And they handed me the RFP. So I wrote the proposal and delivered it to them and invoiced them for a report, and everyone went home happy. Contract. This I shouldn't have to spend much time on. You all know what contracts are. The important thing, though, is there can be a contract for janitorial services, or there can be a contract for building a space telescope and launching it into orbit somewhere beyond the moon. And just as those proposals are going to look very different in the grant space, you know, what I'm talking about with universities, hospitals, research entities are going to look different from what they might be talking about at your local library or your local animal shelter. So I'm going to give you a big picture and kind of the heavy duty version of some of this stuff, but that doesn't necessarily all apply to every grant situation. And we'll talk more about that later on too. Before we get to grant, a couple other things I want to throw at you. In the US, there's something called a Cooperative Agreement, which essentially is a contract except with what's called substantial involvement of the funding entity. Substantial involvement can mean they participate in decisions at key milestones. It can mean they do some of the work alongside you. It can even mean they send someone to physically be co-located at your site while you're doing the work. Something called other transaction or other transaction for prototype. This is where they're not quite sure what it is they're buying. And we saw OTs piling up right and left in, what was it, 2020 now, 2 years ago, at the start of the pandemic, when it was just crash programs everywhere. Get something that will solve the coronavirus. Get to work now, we'll deal with what it is you're actually delivering once we know what it is you're actually able to deliver. So OTs can be kind of a thin ice, but very interesting. And I do want to take just a minute to talk about gifts, because in larger entities, especially university, which is where my experience is, gifts come through a different door and they land in a different account and they're treated differently. It's important because a funding entity, especially a foundation and sometimes a company, will call something a grant, and you look at what's really in the box and it's classified as, we could classify it as a gift. So it's really important to sit down at the start and look at what the opportunity is, if there is a written solicitation, and usually there is, and figure out how is this going to look when it arrives. That comes down to things like, on the cover letter, please make the check payable to. A university will accept a gift into a different fund than a grant or a contract. And you certainly don't want to receive a check in the mail and then call them up and say, would you mind tearing up that check and writing us a new one to a different payee? So I've had many, many meetings where, yeah, the proposal is going to be the same, but we just need to know ahead of time. And sometimes we even talk with the funding entity about this. It's like, okay, you call it a grant. We understand why you call it a grant. We're going to treat it as a gift, which is actually favorable in many ways. So that's why you're going to get a proposal looking the way it looks. Okay, that's almost all I'm going to say about about gifts rather. There's one more thing I'll throw at you in a minute. But let's finally get to grant. And this is in really small type because I don't want you to sit there trying to read it. It's just, if you download this presentation later and throw it in a folder, and a year from now, you need to know the official definition or the official US government definition of a grant, you'll have it in one convenient place. Let's just look at these big words on the right. Transfer anything of value to carry out a public purpose and not to acquire property or services. This is the big difference, I think. It says it's not an acquisition, and it's designed to provide a public purpose, or public purpose is actually a US government term. What that means is when, where did my cursor, there we are. What that means is when the federal government, when Congress apportions money for the budget for the year, they tell each agency, this amount is for this amount is for this. And those are the public purposes. They're defined by Congress, defined by legislation. And all the awards that that agency makes over the next year have to trace back to one of these purposes. When we get outside the federal government, into state, local, foundation, corporate, even individual, instead of saying public purpose, often you'll hear us say public benefit. It's a broader term, it's a squishier term, and it's what I'm going to be using for the rest of this conversation because it's frankly more appropriate and gets us beyond the US federal space. So anyway, that's our official definition. Transfer anything of value to carry out a public purpose and not to acquire property or services. So, and this is just one for your folder. We're not going to spend very much time on it, but here side by side are some of the major funding mechanisms and their characteristics rather than their definitions. Just want to point out two things here. On a gift, there are no deliverables ever. A gift is just what it sounds like. Here's something for you. And there can be no quid pro quo. But gifts, almost always, you're going to do stewardship. And that's not a contractual obligation, that's good manners. Stewardship tells the donor, thank you, we're grateful, and here's what we did with the money. And it can be as much as, a thank you card, or as little as a thank you card, or as much as a 3-day festival where you invite the donor and rename the building after him. So that's just one thing I want to point out about gifts. Over here on grants and gifts, look at the products, which is not necessarily the same as the deliverables. In a grant or in a gift, it's the recipient that owns what comes out of the project. And that becomes very important when we're talking about deliverables and some of the other terms. And we're going to talk about this toward the end of the hour. But I want to point that out too, because it's not something contracts people are accustomed to seeing. Okay. Couple other important, and grants have a few other unique attributes that I want to spend a couple of minutes on before we really get into this. Often there are eligibility restrictions. Multiple awards from a single solicitation. There's not just one winner. There can be dozens. And one solicitation can stay open literally for years. So what that means is you might sit out a cycle and submit your proposal next time instead. You might submit a proposal, lose, and then have another opportunity to resubmit it. The win rates on some US federal research grants are abysmally low, down as low as 7 and 8% sometimes. But the fact that you can resubmit helps quite a bit. And the resubmission thing, different agencies in the US government do it differently. And I think one of the best, I just want to point out to you, the US National Institutes of Health have a formal resubmission mechanism. So you submit your proposal, you didn't get it, shucks. Here are the review comments. Here are the things they didn't like. Well, there's actually most NIH opportunities come 3 times a year. So within a year, you can modify the proposal. And the first page of your resubmission is a summary of what you changed in response to the reviewer comments and why. It's wonderful because it really says, okay, we approached it this way, but in light of your comments, we're going to make this change and we're going to make this change. And often you won't win on the first try, but you will win on the second. And this just shows you, this is the top of the first page of a grant's submission to NIH. And you see there's this button called changed or corrected. You click that, and then you put the old proposal number down in this box, and now it's a resubmission, and you're off to the races. So it's a very nice feature. So, okay, that is the big motivation for grants. This public purpose, public benefit, whatever you want to call it. And here's where I think most APMP people don't understand what really drives a grant. When I say public benefit and I say grant, most of you are thinking rainbow unicorns and people joining hands in the town square and singing Kumbaya. That's not it at all. Public purpose, as I said, is defined by legislation, and it has to go back to something that the government or the funding entity needs to have done. So I want to take you through an example of this from the US Department of Agriculture. I think it's pretty fun. Get your keyboards ready because I'll have a quiz for you. In 2017, the US Department of Agriculture granted more than $150,000 to the Economic Development Entity in Berwick, Pennsylvania, to renovate its movie theater. 1, 2, 3, go. Why did they do that? What's the public benefit of a renovated movie theater in Berwick, Pennsylvania? And I'll give you a couple clues to get started. We're going to do more on this in a minute, but if you have some ideas, some thoughts on why that's a public benefit, let's go ahead and see them in the chat. So what you need to know about Berwick is, number one, it's very far from any major city. Movie theater was historic, Piyush, okay. Number two, Berwick is an agricultural community. The big crop in Berwick is potatoes. And most of those potatoes are sold in the middle Atlantic states of the United States. I think the biggest, I did all this research, I really got into this example. And I think the biggest single customer for Berwick's potatoes is the Wise Potato Chip Company. So if you work in an office in New York City, you know, anyone ever works in an office again, and you run downstairs to get a sandwich and your Diet Coke, it's going to come with a bag of Wise potato chips. And those potato chips began in the soil of Berwick, Pennsylvania. So I've got Piyush saying movie theater was historic. That's the public purpose. Nobody else wants to venture on this? All right. Well, to encourage workers to move there. All right, Caitlin, you're very hot on the trail. Let's go to US Department of Ag's mission statement. You're going to see this paragraph or a paragraph very much like this in just about every USDA grant solicitation. And let's look at these words in red. Support the American agricultural economy to strengthen rural communities, to protect and conserve our natural resources, and to provide a safe, sufficient, and nutritious food supply for the American people. Okay, so the movie theater was not historic. I'll take that off the table right now. But Caitlin's on the right track. American agricultural economy and strengthen rural communities. That's really why this money was motivated. The storyline, or the value proposition, if you will, is that we grow potatoes. Potatoes are nutritious, so that hits that nutritious button. If we don't have a movie theater, we're very far from another city, there's nothing to do, and people are going to move away. And then who's going to grow our potatoes? And shortly after there's no one to grow the potatoes, there's no potato chips in New York City, and chaos ensues. So this USDA is why you need to fund movie theater renovations in Berwick, Pennsylvania. Yes, Ukraine is important. Yes, COVID's a thing, but come on, our real priority has to be happy people in Berwick, Pennsylvania. So that's the value proposition. There are two public benefits in accordance with USDA's mission: vibrant rural community in Pennsylvania, and a sufficient supply of potatoes. And I do want to take just a minute on the nutritious thing, because that is part of their mission statement. You'll see potatoes actually, this is, by the way, this graphic came from the UN, because 2008 was the International Year of the Potato. I mean, I know we all remember that and how great it was, but they had this graphic about potatoes still on their website, which I love. But anyway, lots of potassium, some vitamin C, yay potatoes, they're wonderful. Now the business about most of those potatoes becoming potato chips, which are perhaps not so nutritious after they're fried in oil and doused in salt, maybe let's not mention that, or maybe let's say in our proposal from Berwick, by the way, these potatoes support a lot of manufacturing jobs on the East Coast. And I know that's not USDA's mission, but it's just another little side benefit we thought we'd mention. And then perhaps maybe not mention at all that it's all potato chips and they're not really very good for you. Okay, so like I said, that's one example. It's a real world thing. It really did happen. You saw that picture here on the marquee. It says, "Thank you, USDA Rural Development." And I assume the good people of Berwick are enjoying their movies when COVID allows and growing lots of potatoes, which the people in New York City will enjoy once they're allowed back in their office buildings. So let's zoom out a little bit talk about public benefit motivation for agencies and beyond agencies as well. And you'll see here, I'm using the word sponsor in this slide. Again, this is an example of driving on the other side of the street. You would call them customers. I call them sponsors most of the time. We just talked about agriculture. And what it comes down to in agricultural organizations is enough food and fiber for all. Energy. They want reliable, affordable, safe, clean energy for a healthy economy and happy people. We all just saw a week or two ago in Eastern Europe, I think they doubled the fuel prices and there were riots in the streets. You don't want riots in the streets. Not having riots in the streets is a public benefit. Health agencies, reduced morbidity, lower costs. In the US, access to healthcare is a big thing, and of course, no pandemics. Environment depends on who's in charge. When a Democrat is in running things, you would talk about sustainable and healthful ecosystems. And when Republicans are running things, you talk about resilient infrastructure. I mean, nobody wants to see New Orleans and Miami and New York City sink into the ocean. They just have different ways of expressing that. Space, poor NASA. I never know what their mission really is. It always seems like the big mission at NASA is just somehow to stay ahead of Musk, Branson, Bezos, Russia, and China. So we wish them luck on that. And again, you kind of have to figure out what it is that's motivating them from solicitation to solicitation and hit on their hot buttons. Okay, this, like I said, is certainly government themed, and grants come from more than the federal government. This next example is frankly a poor example, but I think a good illustration. This is George Harrison, the former Beatle. I don't know if any of you remember the movie Life of Brian, which came out in the late 1970s. But George Harrison basically wrote the check that enabled Monty Python to make that movie. And he famously said, well, I did it because I wanted to see the film, which I love. So this was not a gift. This was not a grant. George Harrison made an investment in a company that was making a movie. He became a producer. He even got a cameo in the movie. 1 hour, 9 minutes in, that's George in the crowd scene. But it's the motivation that I want to call your attention to. He didn't do it to make money. He didn't do it to get a cameo in the movie. He did it because he wanted to see the film. And maybe that sort of encapsulates what a grant is about. Okay, so that's kind of the mental roadmap to the money, some sort of public benefit. And knowing that, how are we going to do capture? This should look pretty similar to what you all do every day in your normal course of business for contracts. You need to research the potential sponsors, what they've funded before. You need to know their funding limits and restrictions. Like I said, there can be eligibility requirements. There can be limits on the amount of money they're going to give, what they give to, what they don't give to, the nature of the awards and things like that. Look at past winners, because they're going to have something on their website about the success story, the great things we did when we got the money from the XYZ Foundation. You need to figure out who on your board is friends with someone on their board. It really does matter. And that's often the first question we ask when we're talking about going to a foundation for something. You're almost always going to submit a letter of intent, a pre-proposal, or other inquiry. You're not just going to lob a proposal in through the window and hope for the best. They need to get to know you before they're going to give you money. And on that same note, they're not going to give you $1 million the first time out. You're going to ask for some money and they're going to say, well, what can you do for much, much less? Let's get to know you. Let's see what you can do. Do well with it, and then you'll be in line next time for the larger amounts. Okay, not seeing any questions. I'm assuming either everyone's fallen asleep by now or doesn't care or it's making sense. So I'll go with that third one and we'll just continue going. Okay, so that's your capture. You found a potential funding source. You more or less get the rules and the guidelines. So how do we get from there to an actual proposal process? Well, here we see on the left, I just pulled this date at random. This was the day I wrote the slide. But if you were to go to grants.gov, and you don't need an account for this or a login or anything, but if you just go to grants.gov, there's a button called Search Grants. You click on that, and all the open federal grant opportunities active right now come up. So you'll see this is just a list of what was released on the 14th of December. PAMS is Department of Energy. There's U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Interior, National Science Foundation, a couple from Health and Human Services, Department of State, there's Interior again, and Department of Commerce. If you were to click on any one of these, you would get a synopsis, one-page synopsis. And on that synopsis page, there's a bunch of links, including one called Related Documents. You click on Related Documents and boom, suddenly it all looks like what you're expecting to see. There's going to be what amounts to a request for proposal. So it might not be called that. It might be called an RFA, an RFP, an RF, what else? A BAA, there's all these terms, but they're all really just a request for proposal. Font, margins, number of pages, what to include, what not to include. If there are certain forms that you need to provide with it, they're going to be there for you to download, sign, and upload. The whole package is there. And if you do have an account in grants.gov, you can then subscribe to that opportunity. RFQ, thank you, Jean. Yes. You can subscribe to that opportunity, and whenever there's a change, you should be notified automatically. So if they publish a Q&A, you get it. If they change the due date, you're notified. If they realize they uploaded the wrong signature form and now there's a corrected one, you get notified. So this is where it really starts to look like what everybody in APMP is already familiar with. Let's contrast that with a foundation. This is the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, which is a very large US nonprofit and grant-making agency. Here's what you find when you go there. The mission of Doris Duke Charitable Foundation is to improve the quality of people's lives through grants supporting the performing arts, environmental conservation, medical research, and child well-being. Yay, love it. How the heck are you gonna write a proposal based on that? You're not. It's just not enough to go on. So what you need to do then is go into Doris Duke's website deeper. Here are some of the things they funded this past year. And you'll see, boy, they're really covering every base in that mission. Millions of dollars for medical research, millions of dollars down here for pre-kindergarten readiness and childcare, down to $275,000 for 3 jazz musicians, 2 dancers, and 2 theater writers or directors. So again, that's not enough to write a proposal on, but what you can do is look at those awards, and you click deeper and deeper into the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, you'll see descriptions of those programs. In Doris Duke's particular case, yes, there are formal guidelines which amount to an RFP. This many pages, you know, this font, here's what to write, here's how to submit it, here's who must sign it, all that good stuff. Sometimes it's going to be vaguer than that, and you have to call them or email them and sort of get invited to submit that pre-proposal. And then after that, you really get started. So, okay, now we have an idea of what they consider public benefit. We have a set of instructions, what to write and how to write it. So now let's get into the proposal itself. I mean, yes, a grant proposal, just like a contract proposal, is going to have these sections most of the time. A scope of work, milestones, including payment milestones, outputs and outcomes. And again, I'm avoiding talking about these terms right now. We are going to come to it in more detail later on. And so what I want to do is spend maybe 10 minutes talking about how this would all come together if we were to write a proposal to build a perpetual motion machine under a grant versus under a contract. That's not quite as far-fetched as you might think. DARPA, for example, the US Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, publishes things called BAAs, Broad Agency Announcements, which make multiple awards, usually in multiple thrust areas, and they can make multiple funding mechanisms. So this is just 2 excerpts from one. I basically just pulled this at random last week, just so you see what the language looks like. You see they say explicitly multiple awards are anticipated, and they don't know how much money they're going to put into this program until they see the proposals and know what they like and what they want to go with and what they don't. And then on the next page, proposals identified for negotiation may result in a procurement contract, grant, cooperative agreement, or other transaction, depending on the nature of the work proposed, the required degree of interaction between parties, whether or not the research is classified as fundamental research, and other factors. Fundamental research, we could do an hour on that, and we won't. It's just something that makes it really, really easy for universities to interact with the government without getting into classified information. So yesterday, DARPA came out with a solicitation for perpetual motion. And thrust area 1 is build and deliver a perpetual motion machine. And thrust area 2 is develop next generation perpetual motion technology so we can stay ahead of the Russians, Chinese, Koreans, Bezos, Musk, and everybody else. All right. Now let's say you work for a university and that university has a tech transfer office, and that tech transfer office operates a business incubator. And one of the tenants in the business incubator is Perpetual Motion Incorporated. And Perpetual Motion Incorporated is a startup, but they know what they're doing and they've done their capture and their homework. They knew this was coming, they're ready to go. And your vice chancellor for research says, Mitch, let's do a big kickoff meeting with Perpetual Motion Incorporated and our university people. We'll talk about thrust areas 1 and 2 together and sort of see what shakes out and what proposals we want to submit. Okay, great. So now it's Mitch's job to do a kickoff meeting. And before we get into that, let me just say, yes, I know perpetual motion is impossible. We are proposal people. We do impossible every day, so that's the least of our concerns. All right. So now it's kickoff meeting time. I'm using Tom Sant's framework. This is from his book, The Language of Success. It's perhaps not what you would truly use in a kickoff meeting, but it's a good way to conceptualize it for purposes of this webinar. Tom talks about the NOSE framework, need, outcome, solution, evidence. And so it's 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, we're having our kickoff meeting. Of course, the perpetual motion people showed up early because they're raring to go. They know just exactly what they want to do. University people are still dribbling in and checking their phones. So we talk about thrust area 1 first. What's the need? A machine that can perform work forever with no energy inputs. What's the outcome? And again, this is Tom Sant's term for outcome. The outcome is the deliverable in this sense, a machine that can operate forever with no energy inputs. So the good thing in this framework, here we are, the good thing is what the customer gets in this respect in a contract, okay? Solution is why you should choose us to build your perpetual motion machine. Well, Perpetual Motion Incorporated has anti-gravity paint, patent pending, and they've just come out with a proprietary Mitch's Magic paintbrush, which is now washable. And the great thing, of course, or the problem with anti-gravity paint is as soon as you paint it on, because it's anti-gravity, it flies up into the sky and doesn't stick to the surface. But now with the Magic paintbrush, we've got that problem solved, and plus the paintbrush is washable. So we've got a solution nobody else has. And once your machine is coated with our anti-gravity paint, it will operate forever with no energy inputs. And how do you know we can do this? Yes, we're a startup, but we just acquired a new alchemy division that's been in business since the Middle Ages. They've successfully turned water into wine and lead into gold. So this is great. They've got thrust area 1 all figured out. They're ready to go off back to the business incubator and start writing. And the university people nod their heads and put down their phones, and now it's time to talk about thrust area 2. So what's this grant proposal going to look like? Excuse me, just 1 second. Okay, thrust area 2, what's the need? A machine that can perform work forever with no energy inputs. What's the outcome? Well, now we're talking about a grant. So the outcome is the good thing that happens, the public benefit. Public benefit can be things like new knowledge, new know-how, new ways of making things. It doesn't necessarily have to be a physical deliverable, okay? So the outcome we define at the university for thrust 2 is identification of possible exceptions to the first law of thermodynamics that could revolutionize global energy consumption. There's not going to be anything in my scope of work. You know, task 9 is not going to be revolutionize global energy consumption. It's going to be something that could result from the success of my project. Okay, what's the solution? We've got a bunch of smart people in our College of Engineering and our College of Sciences. They're going to study holes in the laws of thermodynamics, then invent and test a promising magical flywheel. Now, the reason you need a magic flywheel is we all know, we've done the modeling, and anti-gravity paint is great stuff, but it generally only lasts 700 to 800 years, and that's far from perpetual. Whereas a magic flywheel, once you set it in motion, truly will run forever. And how do you know we, the university, can build that magic flywheel and bring this to success? Well, we created the Trump Center for Denial of Science a couple of years ago, and it's had phenomenal success in ignoring reality. So boom, you've now got 2 kickoff meetings, 2 proposals underway. Of course, the university is not going to do the company's proposal if it's a public university because we don't subsidize the private sector. But anyway, off we go. So Mitch goes back to his cubicle and starts working on schedules and writing assignments and all that good stuff. And let's talk about how these different pieces of the proposals are going to look side by side. I welcome your comments on these next couple of slides because you know, frankly, better than I do what the scope of a contract is going to look like versus the scope of a grant proposal. So what you're likely to see when you're proposing that perpetual motion machine in thrust 1, design step, a design review probably. You're going to build a prototype, you're going to test it, you're going to demonstrate it, probably some kind of documentation, right? You're either going to go to their place or they're going to come to yours to learn how to paint on the anti-gravity paint so it doesn't fly up into the sky. And then you're going to deliver everything. And that's your contract. Over here on the grant side, it's more conceptual. Literature review and experimental design. And there might even be a meeting once you've done your experimental design. Everyone agrees that, yes, these are the experiments we want to do. Then you carry out the experiments. You make interim reports, maybe a prototype of the magic flywheel. You're going to have draft final report and a final report. And because knowledge creation is one of the things you're doing, dissemination must be part and parcel of that. If you create new knowledge but don't share it, you haven't created new knowledge. So that's an important part here. Thank you, Michelle. You like slide 24? It gets better. Let's talk about milestones. Again, on the contract side, you're going to have a design stage, design review, fabrication, testing, and these things. It looks a lot like the scope, and you might have payments tied to certain milestones. On the grant side, again, it's tied to the scope, not tied to the milestones. On the grant side, same basic idea. One thing I want to point out, and again, this is more a university thing or a hospital thing. It's not universal across the grant space. But when we submit things from the university for preliminary review, we always accept comments, but we will never, ever, ever agree to a grant that requires approval before we get paid or approval before we move to the next step. And that comes back to academic freedom of universities. Let's say the Trump Center for Denial of Science does the work, but oh my God, realizes perpetual motion is indeed impossible. And we write that in the report and send it to our program officer. The program officer calls us up and says, listen, I got a 2-star general who staked his entire career on perpetual motion. I cannot accept a report that says perpetual motion is impossible. Like, okay, you don't have to accept it. And we can put a comment in the report saying you dispute our finding, but it's still our finding. They could even terminate the agreement at that point and say, okay, if that's where you're going, we don't want any more. Okay, that's their prerogative. But what they can't do is suppress our findings. Because like I said, way back in that slide early on, we own what we create. We can publish it. That poor grad student who worked day and night for 3 years working on this can make that his or her dissertation and get the PhD and get the heck out of there, and so on. So it's important that these things are understood in the context of your organization. And like I said, universities, I can't tell you, we've actually walked away from some stuff based on this. So comment yes, approve no. Deliverables. On a contract, in my mind, deliverables are easy in this example. You're going to deliver the machine, you're going to have that extra gallon of anti-gravity paint, you're going to have 3 paint brushes, and maybe you're going to deliver some training. Yay. On my side, on the grant side, it's different because it's going to be reports, it's going to be data sets, it's going to be things like that. And this is a bit of an aside, but it's, again, important in the US. Starting in 2012, the US government realized they were really getting cheated when they were funding research, because a university would get a grant to do the research, and then the university would pay a journal to publish that research, to peer review it and publish it. And that's part of the dissemination process. And then you'd have to pay again to get a copy of that article, to subscribe to the journal or gain access to the electronic archive, whatever it might be. And the US government said, we're paying 3 times for the same work. So starting in 2012, they required all research grant proposals to have a data management plan. And we have to say in the proposal, what are we going to do with the results of this? How are we going to get it out to where people can use it? And that doesn't mean we have to give anything away. We can still patent stuff, we can still license it, whatever, but we just have to make the knowledge of it available. The key thing here is that data is very, very broadly defined. It's not just numbers on a page. If I produce a magic flywheel and I've got it operating in the corner of my office and someone wants to come and visit it, see how it works, I have to say yes. We have to arrange a time for them to come and look. They can't say, oh, hey, I'd like a magic flywheel of my own. I'm not obligated to build them one. I mean, I'm allowed to. I could say, okay, it's going to cost $1 million and I'll have it for you in a year. But the important thing is at no additional cost or inconvenience to me, I have to make available what it is I've produced with government money. Okay, this is actually a wonderful thing. There have been some huge battles over the last few years between the for-profit academic or scientific publishing companies and the academic community and the US government. Mostly the academic community and the US government are winning, and it's a better thing. That means the knowledge is getting out there more readily and more quickly than it used to. Okay, and I want to do just one more minute on outputs and outcomes. Outputs, and this is actually explicit in some solicitations. US EPA does this a lot. Some other agencies do too. On a contract, output is essentially the deliverable, the thing that you produce and give to the customer. Outcome is not really your problem. If you deliver a working perpetual motion machine, and it does indeed revolutionize the energy industry, and that revolution takes the form of the entire oil sector is now out of work and rioting in the streets of New Orleans, not a good outcome, but an outcome. But that's not your thing. That's not part of your contract. That's something that's external to what you did. Over here on the grant side, the outputs are the things we did during the work, the data, the prototypes, the knowledge, whatever, the publications, all of that. And the outcomes are what we said initially, the good things that would happen based on the success of our project. If we're right, and if we accomplish what it is we said we were going to accomplish, those are the outcomes. Those are the rainbow unicorns and the people in the town square singing Kumbaya. Okay? US National Science Foundation requires a section in every proposal called broader impacts, where it's not what you are necessarily doing, but it's about the good things that will happen if you're right and if you're successful. If a proposal does not have a broader impact section, NSF returns it without review. So they take it that seriously. Okay, one minor point, or I should say one final point, and that is that I mentioned this at the beginning, just like a contract for building a space telescope and launching it into the sky is not going to look like a contract for janitorial services, grants for perpetual motion machines are not going to look like grants for your local animal shelter or your local library to acquire books or run a reading program. They're all over the map. I mean, you know, universities have these highly evolved grant structures that are designed to get the money and interact with the agencies and make sure everything's good. And your local library has some poor person who will try to write something up on the weekend, and usually it's horrible. One of the great things since I retired is I can help those people who don't, you know, frankly, the grant is too small for them to hire a consultant, and their budget is too small for them to hire a consultant. So I can go in there without taking food out of any consultant's mouth and help them. It's really fun, and just, you know, for their eyes to light up when they say, oh, that's what I should have said, is a great thing. So I've given you really, really big picture stuff. It does apply to the local library and it does apply to the billion-dollar hospital, but it's going to apply unevenly. Finally, there are some resources that are really pretty nice. There are books, there are websites. One thing I'll point out, it's really kind of cool. Federal Demonstration Partnership, FDP, was created 15, maybe 20 years ago as a partnership between federal grant-making agencies and grant recipients, universities, hospitals, museums, research stations, to make the grant process more sensible. So there's pre-award policies, there's post-award policies, there's accounting and audit policies. And if you're an FDP member, which most of this ecosystem is, It's all pre-negotiated. You just have to worry about the proposal, and the award says standard FDP conditions apply. You sign, they sign, and you're off to the races. So there's a ton of stuff. If you go to the FDP, a ton of information there. I don't know how relevant it will be to you, but you really can get into the philosophy of grants and how they work in the real world. I've been to some FDP meetings in Washington. They're hideously political, but like I said, they're doing some really cool stuff. That's what I have to share with you. If there are questions.
Yes, Mitch, I'll start with a few questions, Mitch. Mitch, we all talk about bid processes. Is there anything called grant processes?
Well, I would say they're proposal processes.
Yeah.
So it's, the target is it's not the same target, but it is the same process in many respects in the larger stuff.
Perfect. So yes, I think so. Do you still conduct the capture thing and the kickoffs, red reviews, the solutioning and other things? So that, or things differed?
No, that's really, at the larger scale, at a university scale, when you're doing it right and taking it seriously, yes, you do all of those things. I mean, I hate to tell you sometimes what passes for process at a university, and I hate to tell you how many times the professor has walked in 3 days before and said, I want to do a proposal on this. And okay, have you done any of the homework? Have you done any of the things that successful people do? Well, I've been busy. It's like, okay, you're a professor. You have students, you teach classes. You can tell which student pulled an all-nighter, and did this thing that was due at 9 this morning overnight. And you can tell which student worked on this for 3 weeks, right? Yeah, I said, the reviewers can tell that too. So let's not do a proposal in 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mitch. We have a few questions. Mitch. Let me read. I think Michelle's just sharing. Grantsmanship Center training is a gold standard. They conduct workshops all over the US, meet colleagues and collaborate with these. So I think she's just giving a point.
Yes. And Michelle, I agree with you. They do great stuff.
Perfect. And question from Piyush. What are the most relevant headings you should include in the grant proposal? Is there anything that you say, like, do we include like the benefit heading?
I would. Let's talk about US federal government just as an example in answer to this question. Since it has to trace directly to a public purpose, to something Congress directed them to do, there's going to be language in the solicitation saying, this is why this project is authorized. This is why we're doing this. And you want to pick up on that and write in your proposal, just like I talked about in Berwick. You need healthy rural communities. You need safe, sufficient supplies of nutritious food. You need these things, and boom, here is how this proposed project addresses those specific things Congress directed you to come up with. So specific headings, you're going to have to go to the solicitation. The Doris Duke jazz musician thing is going to have a whole different structure from the Doris Duke medical research thing and from the US EPA science to achieve results thing. So start with the RFP and follow it religiously.
Thank you, Mitch. And is it, how does the pricing mechanisms work, Mitch? Because in the traditional proposals, as you know, even though they say quality comes first, price comes second, and the buyers get the minimum threshold, then we'll read your proposal and the quality kind of a thing. Do you find the same thing in the grants as well?
Yes. Now, obviously, our costs are almost all personnel costs. It's going to be the professor and grad students and, time in the anti-gravity chamber, those sorts of things. So it's, there will be, your institution will have standard pricing and published salary scales and all that stuff. And we have to do budget justifications just like you do, except it's, again, mostly labor. There are, federally approved indirect cost rates and all that stuff. So we don't do earned value management systems. I don't know if many people have experience with that, but research just doesn't lend itself to EVMS. So I write this sort of apology for why we don't do EVMS instead.
Thank you, Mitch. Mitch, a question from Scott Johnson. As a small nonprofit, is it best to partner with a large organization to position yourself to get funded, or to go solo and go for smaller funds?
I really like that question. It's going to depend on the opportunity and on the relationship. I mean, if you're a small nonprofit, but you have a friend on the board of the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, I would start there and go on my own. One experience I had last year as a volunteer was this very, very small medical charity, medical foundation, that they address a severely underdiagnosed medical condition. The doctors don't check for it, and therefore people aren't diagnosed with it and aren't treated for it. They're trying to raise awareness and get research going. And I helped them come up with a whole funding strategy. And they were like, in their first meeting, like, oh, well, we can go to NIH for this, right? The National Institutes for Health. And I said, I saw a comment earlier about how walking the halls at NIH is so important. And yes, it is. I said, you people are 5 years away from your first NIH dollar. But you already have friends at universities and hospitals that are getting NIH money. And you could latch on to one of their projects, or you could latch on to their next proposal. And they do all the hard work. They know all the NIH nomenclature. They know all the steps you go through for these awards to come into fruition. And then once they've done all that, they issue a sub-award to you for you to go do your little slice of it. It's a great way to do business, and it makes a lot of sense because you get the experience. You don't need 10 lawyers and accountants and federally approved accounting systems and all those things, because that's sort of handled at a level above you. So again, depending on the opportunity, that can be a very, very smart way to go.
Thank you, Mitch. Hope that's useful, Scott. Alyssa just mentioned, that thing that you told about the professor. It's a great analogy to use.
Alyssa lives in my world. We had that conversation back in Denver, I think, a few months ago.
Yes. Now, Michelle also says in California, county government may have more relevant service grants than state. I don't know, maybe it's a statement, or Mitch, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, grants come from all over. And usually if there's a local source and you're in that locale, I'd say your chances are going to be better. We have here in Southern California, there's something called the South Coast Air Quality Management District, whose job is to control air pollution in the region. And part of that mission belongs to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and part of it belongs to the California Air Resources Board, and part of it belongs to South Coast. And the fact that UC Riverside is in the South Coast territory matters, and makes us a better competitor for that money. An even better example might be City of Riverside has its own municipal utility, and they're required to put a surcharge on electric bills for research. And guess what? You have to be in Riverside to claim any of that money. So it's not very much, but we get 1 to 2 grants a year from Riverside Public Utilities to do research related to electric supply in California, and specifically in Riverside. So yeah, local, state, everywhere. There's money all over the place, and if you know where it is, you can get it. Perfect.
Mitch, I think this could be the last question, or we are opening up 1 minute to go for the Scribble quiz. So please do questions. So Alyssa just points out again, in my experience, that an FFRDC partnering can often be a huge benefit, both at the big and small institutions. You will need to be aware of specific rules, policies on both ends that may exist before starting the partnership. I think she's also adding her view to Scott's question. Yes. Yes. So any last minute questions before? Do you still, once you work on a proposal, since you go for the resubmission, Mitch, that's an interesting thing on grants. So once you submit it, you get a feedback, and then you review and you go for resubmission. How many resubmissions can you do, Mitch?
Depends on the agency. NIH, I believe, is down to 1. So you do the original proposal. It's called A0. 0 means it's never been submitted before. And if you don't get it, then you're allowed to do an A1. And there's a time window. I think it's within 12 months. There are 3 times per year you're allowed to submit proposals. And so yeah, on one of those windows, you can submit your A1, and that's got that one-page summary of what we changed. And if you don't get that, I think you're now blacked out for a little while before you can submit something similar to that again. You can submit a different proposal, but not a reincarnation of that proposal. So that's NIH. There are others, like National Science Foundation doesn't actually believe there is such a thing as a resubmission. So every proposal is a unique event, and it's going to get different reviewers, unfortunately. So NSF, you could pitch the same idea 10 times in a row if you wanted to, though I think by about the third time, people are going to start saying, oh, not him again, and not read it very carefully. So 2 is a really good number. If you're not winning after the second try, maybe it's time for an offline conversation with the program officer to see what's, if there's something perhaps you're not getting.
Perfect. Thank you, Mitch. Thanks for that. And now we begin the Scribble quiz. So the fastest person gets the win. So are we ready? Stay close to the chat box. So the first question, which funding form doesn't have a deliverable? Let's see who goes first. Which funding form? Michelle, nice work. Michelle gets it. So next question. When Mitch was talking about, he was talking about grants, and you mentioned an interesting win rate. What was the win rate that Mitch mentioned for a grant submission?
Worst case.
Okay. Close. 7 to 8%, right, Mitch?
Yep.
Correct. Michelle, you're an amazing listener. John.
Michelle's a ringer on this. Michelle, I don't know what you do, but you already know this.
This slide. Anyway, next question. Which year was the International Year of Potato? Oh, people are thinking, oh no, Daisy, it's.
No.
At least you tried, Daisy. Anybody?
I'm trying to help you. Whoops.
2020, no.
Too far, didn't I?
It's a decade before.
Yep. I'll get there, just a second.
One last try. Anybody? It's 2008, isn't it?
2008.
Correct. See, I get all these things that shouldn't be part of the grant thing, but that's great. So, two more, last minute. What's the word for customer in a grant proposal? Ooh, Caitlin, you nailed it. You were quick. Nice. So the last question. What's the movie George Harrison from funded and acted in a cameo role? It's a long title. If you get this, you get a brownie point because it's not easy. What's the name of the movie? Life of Brian?
Yeah, they got it.
Titans, yeah, full title. I will give it to both Caitlin, Michelle, and also Caesar. Caesar, obviously Caesar got the full answer, but I'll give it to all three of you. So, and that ends, let me write it down. Normally, I'm notorious for saying, yeah, well done, and I completely forget who told the answer. So, I'm going to go back and ask, Zoom, please, can you tell me who won? So thank you. I think that's Scribble quiz done. Again, team will send you the details around it. Hope you enjoyed Mitch's presentation. If you enjoyed it, please drop 1 or 2 lines to say thank you. That would really help us and also help Mitch, who woke up like 7 a.m., 6:45 actually, and to deliver this presentation. So thank you, Mitch, and thank you everybody for joining Office Hours webinars again. We continue every week, as you know. So next week we have Chris Simmons talking about telling your story, compliant and compelling proposal themes. As always, You will find the link in live workshop, but let me add it again here so that you know. If you want to register your place, to register. But thank you again for joining Office Hours webinars. Thank you, Mitch, for sharing your time. As I mentioned, the recordings, everything will be shared to you in the next 48 hours. After 5 days, the video will be posted in YouTube. The people who attended will get the slides and the relevant resources. So thank you again. Take good care all. Stay healthy. We'll see you next week.
Great. Thank you.